You could say that wherever there is virtue, there will be far more people signaling that virtue than there are people or groups or entities actually possessing that virtue. That is nowhere more true than in crypto. Anyone seriously studying crypto soon learns that the great virtue of crypto is decentralization. Unfortunately, that also means that every single crypto business or crypto adjacent business will try to very convincingly signal that virtue. You would think that the crypto space would have a strong immune response to anything wearing the robes of crypto that wasn't decentralized. Instead, the space has embraced a multitude of centralized projects as long as they can present an all important offering of sweet and delicious yields. Now, all those compromises and corruptions are catching up to us in the worst possible way. This should be a lesson that it's time that we, the entire crypto space, finally live up to this label of decentralization. Ready? Let's go. Today, we're going to discuss Charles straight killing it and pointing out some pretty important things in a recent mega crypto Twitter space. The Dragon doing exactly what you'd expect with all this recent news. The Wall Street Journal with a horrible but unsurprising headline. And Senator Lummis with an explanation of why all of this wouldn't have happened, in her view at least, under her bill. If you see this image and think to yourself, hey man, I don't care what the label says. I just want to know how I escape Barbie's secret Malibu human experimentation lab. Or if you're finding value in these videos each weekday, please consider delegating to the Army of Spies stake pool, ticker AOS. Charles was recently on a mega crypto Twitter space. It was hosted by some people who have kind of been hosting Twitter spaces every hour of the day since the whole FTX Alameda scandal, affair, event, whatever you want to call it, crisis. Ever since this all went down, they've been hosting this huge number of hours of Twitter spaces per day to sort of capture every single angle on this whole FTX Alameda thing. And they've been scoring some pretty big guests, some pretty big names in crypto. And in this Twitter space, it was all at once. I don't want to call them luminaries of crypto, but definitely really big names in crypto that you would recognize. And they also got Charles. One thing all of us inside the Cardano ecosystem know is that if you just hand Charles a microphone, he's going to shine. If it's any topic he's ever thought about before for even a moment, he's going to shine if you just give this dude a microphone. And that's exactly what we saw in this Twitter space. Charles managed to put together a very coherent, cohesive, well thought out, concise argument when it was his turn to speak in this Twitter space. A lot of the other guests, even if they were the heads of big projects, just kind of seemed, either very, very overtly or very subtly overwhelmed by the chaos of all this. And part of that is due to the fact that outside of the Cardano ecosystem, a lot of the big projects are very tightly interwoven. They're all very interdependent, all very interconnected. So when an entity as big as FTX / Alameda, I know they're two separate entities, but we're just going to talk about them as one. When an organization this big goes down, it kind of affects everyone. And we've seen the dominoes sort of slowly falling over. Hedge funds, even crypto. I saw a crypto hedge fund today say that they were holding most of their hedge fund assets on FTX. So, of course, they're in trouble. And we're just hearing about the ones right now that are admitting to it. There's others out there that are scrambling, trying to find some way out of this problem. They probably won't. And we won't hear about them until they absolutely have to disclose that they too are being fatally impacted by the whole FTX Alameda thing. Not so much for Cardano. Inside Cardano, we're not as interconnected with all of the rest of the entities, especially in the account balance sort of EVM side of the world. We're not so tightly interwoven with all of these entities that play such a big role over there. So, of course, Cardano is doing a lot better throughout this whole period of chaos. it's kind of funny because it used to be a very common refrain that Cardano urgently needed to increase its interoperability with, basically every other big blockchain. But what we've seen recently, and that might be true long term, but what we've seen recently is that not being interoperable with these other blockchains has just saved us over and over and over again, including in this case. Sure, I mean, the prices of every single asset in the crypto space are going to be impacted by something this big, but it could have been a lot worse for Cardano if all of our entities were as tightly interconnected with something like an FTX, Alameda, conglomerate organization like a lot of the entities outside of Cardano. But whatever made the difference, Charles seemed to be one of the speakers who actually had something coherent to say about how we sort of leave this era of crypto where these things keep happening over and over again. And his message was clearly that we need to live up to the promise of decentralization. He talked about how crypto in general has always sort of worn this label of decentralization. And certainly, if you ask any crypto enthusiast, tell me why crypto is so great, decentralization is going to be a word coming out of that person's mouth in like the first 12 seconds. One of the first things they're going to say that will mean something will be that crypto is great because of decentralization. That's been the message all along. Certainly, that was a central piece of Satoshi's invention. And I know some of you will say, well, technically, there was this protocol before Bitcoin and Satoshi was just standing on the shoulders of, that kind of thing. Of course, that's all true. But Satoshi definitely brought some innovation when he released the Bitcoin white paper. And the central piece of that was how we achieve consensus on this distributed decentralized asset ledger. The decentralization piece was the big piece. And as crypto grew in popularity, as more and more of us jumped on board, the thing that attracted all of us was the decentralization piece. But then, very shortly after Bitcoin grew in popularity, something else started happening, something other than the growth of decentralization. People immediately took these decentralized crypto assets and started kind of wrapping them up in centralized entities. And I don't mean that in the sense of wrapped assets like we commonly talk about in crypto. I mean, they started entangling these decentralized assets in these centralized entities. And in the case of Bitcoin, when we just had Bitcoin and assets like it was kind of necessary because there were no smart contracts as we think about them today. There was no programmability in Bitcoin to do things like dexes. We didn't have smart contracts. You couldn't create a Bitcoin DEX with smart contracts because Bitcoin wasn't a smart contract protocol. That didn't come along until later with things like Ethereum and everything that came out of the whole crypto 2.0 movement. But with Bitcoin, you kind of had to have centralized entities. There had to be a Coinbase, there had to be a Kraken if you wanted to have trading of these assets. Sure, there was person-to-person trading with things like local Bitcoins, but aside from that, which couldn't really scale, that sort of person-to-person trading, very difficult to make it scale, very easy for these centralized entities to come along, Bitfinex, Coinbase, Kraken, Bitstamp, a million others came along. And that was pretty much the only way you could achieve sort of Bitcoin trading at scale. But then we got the second generation of crypto with Ethereum, and we had smart contracts, and all of a sudden we could create decentralized exchanges, and things were looking better. Hey, maybe now we can escape from this world of decentralized assets, which are good, but having to do anything complicated with them in these centralized settings, inside these centralized machines like Coinbase and Kraken. And I'm not faulting the founders of those entities at all. They created something that was necessary at the time. And a lot of those early founders really do embrace the original ethos of crypto and decentralization. But now we're in a place where we don't need that anymore. And yet, what happened? Even with the second generation of crypto, we kept reinventing we kept reinventing the traditional finance world and all of Web 2 inside crypto. We kept entangling our decentralized assets with these centralized machines. Everybody realized, hey, I can create a centralized entity, a centralized platform, offer people a yield, and they'll give up custody of their decentralized assets. They'll take their decentralized assets, whatever they might be, and deposit them in my centralized platform, kind of transforming them into centralized assets. At least we can say the control of those assets goes from self custody to centralized custody. The thing is, none of this was necessary. It was never necessary for us to rebuild Wall Street inside crypto. We never needed to do any of that. The whole purpose of Satoshi's invention was to get away from all that. We didn't need to bring that back in, but there was money to be made, and they figured out how to make the right offering, as if they were making an offering to the crypto gods. And that offering was sweet and delicious yields. They were able to offer users yields beyond what could be otherwise found in the market. All you had to do was give up custody. You know what I always say? Give me custody or give me death. It's the most important thing. Whenever you find yourself depositing your crypto anywhere, you're pretty much not doing crypto anymore. That's not crypto. If you're depositing your crypto somewhere, you're no longer doing crypto. You're doing something else, some kind of perversion of crypto. It is. If you're depositing your crypto somewhere, it's a perversion of crypto. You can use your crypto to buy things. That was certainly part of the idea of Satoshi's invention, that we have this alternate monetary system, this alternate economic system, and you would be using Bitcoin as money. That was definitely the idea. You could buy things with Bitcoin and the cryptos that came after it. That was definitely all part of the idea. But giving up your self custody, depositing your decentralized assets with someone else for those sweet and delicious yields, that was never part of the idea. That was never necessary. That's a perversion of crypto. They're rebuilding Wall Street inside crypto. And we've done this in a million different ways. We've built these sort of deposit and pray type institutions, these platforms. I think you can just say it's sort of a deposit and pray. You just sort of deposit them, and then you find yourself praying that you don't fall victim to the robbery forest, some kind of hack or exploit or rug pull, or that the entity just fails because there was some kind of an unseen risk in the system. Recently it was like an FTX, Alameda. Before that, it was, Terra Luna 3AC. And this has happened over and over again in crypto. We have these deposit and pray type institutions, and everybody does it. You would think that the immune response from crypto, given where we came from, given the original ethos of crypto, you would think our immune response would immediately reject anything that requires us to give up our self custody, to centralize our decentralized assets. You would think that people immediately would be like, ha ha ha, never, never. I will never give up my self custody. Sure, I might want to trade or something. I actually don't think that people should really trade, but the average person should not. I think somebody said this week, the average crypto person should make an average of 0 trades. I think that's probably true. But let's say you want to do some of those things. We have decentralized exchanges. In Cardano, you don't even need to deposit, really. You might have to lock your funds with a smart contract or something like that, but you don't even really have to deposit if you don't want to. That's where we kind of went wrong. We started doing all this stuff that was completely unnecessary. We still let those types of platforms wear the robes of crypto. But part of that whole crypto thing that was sold to everyone, it had this label of decentralization on it. And as soon as we didn't immediately reject those platforms, we were betraying that label. So people seem to be asking in this Twitter space, Where do we go from here? What's next? How do we fix this? And Charles had a very simple and straightforward answer for them. It's time that the crypto space lives up to this label of decentralization. We can't do crypto and embrace these centralized entities any longer. We need to have an immune response that we reject, that crypto rejects these centralized entities, because it always brings us here. It always leads to these bad outcomes. Crypto has this label on it, decentralization. We actually need to live up to that label. We can't say, oh, crypto's so great, decentralization, but at the same time, all my assets are parked over here so I can get, in the case of a lot of these entities recently, it hasn't even been that gigantic a yield, just a slightly better yield than I could get elsewhere. We can't do that any longer. We actually have to live up to this label of decentralization. Why do we need that decentralization so bad? Why do we so badly need to live up to that label? One reason, trustlessness. And here's a great example of that. The Wall Street Journal ran this headline today. Alameda amassed crypto tokens ahead of FTX listings. We can't have this kind of thing going on. There was no trustlessness with this centralized entity. Everyone was trusting SBF and Caroline and all the rest of them to do the right thing, to not do anything to their detriment. And of course, shocker, they did the exact opposite, according to this headline. It looks like Alameda was front running the listing of assets at FTX. Of course, FTX got to be a big enough exchange that if they listed an asset, its price was going to go up. And so Alameda, of course, they knew that because, all of the people running FTX in Alameda, apparently, or at least 10 of them, were all living together in that gigantic penthouse in the Bahamas and doing all kinds of things, apparently. But they obviously knew which tokens were going to be listed by FTX. And according to this article, at least, and they were buying those assets ahead of time. That's not the result of a decentralized system where there's trustlessness. But this is exactly why we need that type of system. We can't trust these centralized entities to not do this kind of thing. Crypto not having that immune response and not living up to that label of decentralization is also going to lead to a lot more of this. Here's the dragon saying the collapse of one of the largest crypto platforms. You notice this is very intentional language, very carefully crafted language. She doesn't distinguish between decentralized and centralized crypto platforms. She doesn't care. She just wants any talking point that she can use to create a foothold to go after crypto. She wants to go after all of crypto. She doesn't care at all that we're talking about a centralized exchange versus all of the completely decentralized things we have in crypto. All she cares about is that this is a talking point she can use to create a foothold to go after all of crypto. She says the collapse of one of the largest crypto platforms shows how much of the industry appears to be smoke and mirrors. Hear that? She's saying a lot of the industry is just smoke and mirrors. We need more aggressive enforcement, and I'm going to keep pushing SEC Gov to enforce the law to protect consumers and financial stability. We're going to be hearing about this for the next year, maybe the next couple of years, depending on how bad this FTX thing gets. She'll be using FTX as a talking point for years. And it's our fault. It's our fault because we didn't reject all these kinds of centralized entities in our decentralized crypto landscape. Of course, there are also people in Washington who understand that there are centralized and decentralized parts of crypto and that there are good and bad parts of crypto. One of them seems to be Senator Lummis. She points out here the FTX bankruptcy bill wouldn't happen under the Lummis-Gillibrand bill. And here's why. The Lummis-Gillibrand bill, you'll know, is that one that probably can't be passed as it stands. It's too big and does too many things, would have to go through too many committees, so it'll probably never pass as it stands. But it was a pretty good swing at good crypto regulation. She talks about all of the good things that bill does. Down here, somebody points out something important about all this. They say but it was an offshore exchange. It was an offshore exchange, which is true. FTX International was an offshore exchange. But the thing is, and what's been pointed out very strongly by people like Jesse Powell, founder of Kraken, and Brian Armstrong, founder of Coinbase, is that the lack of regulatory clarity didn't allow for the regulated onshore exchanges in the US to do the same things that FTX was doing. So all of the capital flowed offshore to entities like FTX. Once we actually get a good regulatory regime that provides regulatory clarity so that the onshore entities can do all the things they need to do, all of this capital won't flow to an FTX that on the sly is doing all the bad things. And I think we'll all be better off for that. But we'll see where this is going to go. The sad thing is, this will just keep happening if we don't develop that immune response where we just reject those centralized entities. Now is the time when we need to strongly embrace decentralization and finally live up to that label once again. I hope you're having a great week, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.